Okay, I get it, I missed some, okay? But in my defense, when I started watching the Universal Monster movies, I was not aware what was important and what was not important. But now, thanks to my last video and all of your comments, I am a Universal Monster movie expert. And I'm watching the ones that I missed last time, and I'm starting with the time Abbott and Costello met the Universal Monsters. Starting off with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, I originally didn't include these movies in my first watch through because I thought they were like comedy parody movies. I didn't realize that they were actually pretty true to the original monsters. And I was met with an incredible surprise when I started watching this one. In this movie, Bela Lugosi reprises his role as Dracula for the first time since the first Dracula movie in 1931, the one that started it all. And Lon Chaney Jr. returns in his iconic role as the Wolfman. In this movie, Frankenstein is portrayed by Glenn Strange, which is a reprisal since he played Frankenstein in like House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. However, it would have been awesome if we could have actually gotten Boris Karloff to play the monster in the film, because I think if that was the case, this would have been the first time that those three actors were all playing their original roles in the same movie at the same time. But it's all right. It's, you know, you can't have everything. In Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, we see Dracula trying to steal Costello's brain because he needs a brain dumb enough to put into the monster so that way he listens to all commands and he's just generally stupid. The issue is, our main man, Lawrence Talbot, who is also the Wolfman, has been following Dracula and Frankenstein's whereabouts and trying to help the people that they come into contact with. So this movie sees Abbott, Costello, and the Wolfman versus Dracula and Frankenstein. And dude, this is such a blast of a movie. I can't believe that I missed it in my first watch through. Now here's a little behind the scenes of this movie before I move on to the next one. It turns out that Abbott and Costello were kind of a nightmare when filming this movie. They did not want to film this movie, but they were kind of tricked into doing it. So they were constantly missing from the set, and when they were on set, they were mostly just playing cards. The director was actually quoted saying that the three monsters were a dream. The real monsters were Abbott and Costello, which that's kind of a bummer to hear, but the movie ended up being super successful. The budget for the movie was just under $800,000, and it made over $3 million in the box office. So when Universal saw that, they were like, hey, Abbott and Costello need to meet more monsters. The original script for Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein originally had several other monsters in the film. The Mummy, Dracula's son, the Invisible Man. But by the time they got to the final version of the script, they lost those characters, with the Invisible Man's role ended up being a small cameo at the end, played by Vincent Price. Another super interesting fact about this movie is that the makeup process changed pretty drastically to the previous films. Typically for the monster, they had a several hour-long makeup prosthetic process, but for this one, they just had kind of like a rubber mask, and it only took about an hour. Which is pretty ironic because the reason that Boris Karloff hated playing that role and refused to ever do it again was because the makeup process was so tedious. But that doesn't mean that this movie was without mishaps. No, Glenn Strange ended up breaking his foot, which it seems like every time someone plays the monster, there's some sort of injury involved. Because he broke his foot, Lon Chaney Jr. actually took up the role of the monster that day, making it a reprisal of the time that he played Frankenstein's monster in The Ghost of Frankenstein. As I've already mentioned, I really enjoyed this movie. I mean, the second you start it, you see this fun animated intro, which really sets the tone, and then the movie kicks off with Lawrence Talbot, aka the Wolfman. The Wolfman is one of my favorite characters in these original Universal Monster movies. It's just such a great character. You have this poor, terrified man who every time there's a full moon, he turns into the Wolfman. And you can tell he's a genuinely good person, and then he becomes a monster. And I just find it super fascinating because you really get to watch Lawrence Talbot age. And that's largely due to the fact that Lon Chaney Jr. holds the very rare achievement of being the only actor to play his monster. So all the way at the Wolfman movie, to the Wolfman Meets Frankenstein, all the way through to where we are right now with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, I got to watch Lon Chaney Jr. as Lawrence Talbot as the Wolfman become an old man. Or should I say older man? I don't know how old he was when he did that movie. And then plus you take the Wolfman, the Lawrence Talbot character, you throw in Abbott and Costello as the victims of Dracula and Frankenstein, and you just have a great dynamic overall. It's a total blast. Plus, Dracula comes to a Halloween party dressed as Dracula, so, bonus points. Oh yeah, and don't forget, it has one of my favorite shots of any of the Universal Monster movies. Spoiler alert, but at the end, Dracula turns into a bat and flies through a window to try to escape, but the Wolfman crashes through the window, grabs the bat in midair, and just drags him to the rocky sea below. Pretty baller. Because I skipped this movie in my initial watch through for my last video, ironically, it's exactly what I thought all of the Universal Monster movies were going to be like. I thought all of these movies were going to be a ton of fun. We're going to see monsters meeting up with each other and terrorizing people, and that's exactly what this movie is. Most of the other Universal Monster movies aren't like this one. The other ones are true dramatic horror movies. I mean, they seem a little cheesy now, but I mean, they came out in the 1930s and 40s. This movie does what House of Dracula, House of Frankenstein tried to do, give a fun team-up movie, and this one really nailed it. And to cap off this section, the movie ends with Vincent Price returning as the Invisible Man, just his voice, and it's like a short little cameo.
All relax. Now that we've seen the last of Dracula, the Wolfman and the monster, there's nobody to frighten us anymore.
Oh, that's too bad. I was hoping to get in on the excitement.
Who said that?
Allow me to introduce myself. I'm the Invisible Man.
And it was actually pretty reminiscent of like an MCU post-credits scene. I don't know, I think I'm rambling about this movie at this point, so let's move on to the next one, which is Abbott and Costello meets the Invisible Man. Now, riding the high of the last movie, I could not wait to watch this one. I was expecting it to be another fun monster team up. We were gonna see the Invisible Man, maybe we would see the Mummy, maybe we would see Jekyll and Hyde, who knows? But I very quickly realized that this movie was very, very different from the last one. In fact, it was not intended at all to be a sequel to the last Abbott and Costello movie. It was, however, intended to be a direct sequel to the original 1933 Invisible Man movie. And we see a direct connection with the first 1933 movie when they have like a framed picture of the original Invisible Man in the office. It was really cool to see Claude Rains, who's the actor who played Dr. Jack in the first Invisible Man movie, like up on the wall, because you're like, oh, there's a canon here. It's a direct sequel. And in fact, the movie was originally written to just be a sequel to that movie. They didn't want Abbott and Costello involved at all until they saw how well in the box office the last Abbott and Costello movie did. So then Universal was like, hey, just write these fellas in. This movie follows a boxer who's framed for the murder of his manager. And in an effort to clear his name, no pun intended, he takes the Invisible Man serum to try to escape so he can try to figure out who actually killed his manager. He hires these two private detectives, Abbott and Costello, to help him try to clear his name. The movie had a budget of $627,000, and it raked in over $1.5 million, which isn't as great as the last Abbott and Costello movie, but we're talking back in the day. That's a big chunk of change. So this was another huge success for Universal, and even though it didn't include a bunch of, classic monsters teaming up with Abbott and Costello, it was still a really incredible movie. Now, as incredible as it was, and I really loved this movie as a movie, it didn't quite have the same feeling as the other Universal Monster movies. I don't know if it makes sense, but it's kind of like in the original Invisible Man series, how after the second or third one, they do The Invisible Woman, and that one wasn't even a horror movie at all. It was like a rom-com. And then they did Invisible Agent, which was more of like a propaganda war movie. It was like a secret agent movie. It really wasn't like, do you see what I'm saying? This was a really incredible movie, but I wouldn't exactly say it was a Universal monster movie. Leading into our next movie, which is Abbott and Costello meets Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I didn't realize that this movie even existed. It wasn't until I was doing research for the first one, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, that I saw this movie pop up. And I was super confused because this movie isn't included in any of the Universal Monster collection lists. After watching the movie, I can kind of understand why. However, this movie does see the return of Boris Karloff. Boris Karloff is the iconic actor who played Frankenstein's monster in the original and, played it in several others. He played other Universal monsters like the Mummy and, etc., etc. In this movie, he plays Dr. Jekyll, but not Mr. Hyde. I'll get into that in a second. This movie, very much like the Invisible Man one, it's very much its own thing. Abbott and Costello are playing cops, and they're investigating the murders of people in London, and these murders are taking place by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's a classic Abbott and Costello film. There's tons of jokes and tons of gags, and it's just a really fun movie that's exactly what you expect when you hear the words Abbott and Costello meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I was super pumped to see Boris Karloff. He does play Dr. Jekyll, but when the transformation of Mr. Hyde is complete, the role is taken over by someone else. And that someone else is stuntman Eddie Parker, and we'll talk a little bit about him in the next movie. But this movie was super dope, and I'm starting to understand the tone of these movies. After the first one, which was this super dope team up of classic actors reprising their classic monster roles, and it was just a blast. The next one, The Invisible Man, it's its own movie, and then this one, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is its own movie. It's just Abbott and Costello meeting different Universal monsters, which is a little bit of a change of pace from the first one, but it's still amazing. So now we're going to move on to this next movie, Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, to see how this series really wraps up. No pun intended. Once again, this movie is exactly what you think when you hear the words Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. It's a classic Abbott and Costello movie, gags, jokes, and this time they've met the mummy. It really seems like at this point they were just like, okay, what kind of gags can we do with a mummy? What kind of gags can we do with an invisible man? What kind of gags can we do with a serum that turns you into this monster named Mr. Hyde? And it's a ton of fun. In this movie, we see Eddie Parker. He's the stuntman who played Mr. Hyde in the last movie. He plays the mummy, which is a pretty cool return of sorts because he actually doubled for Lon Chaney Jr. when it was his turn playing the mummy in some previous Universal movies. Now, if you saw my last video, you know I'm not a huge fan of the Mummy films, and this one was actually probably my favorite iteration of the Mummy. It just gave the Mummy a little bit more like personality, you know what I mean? Like, it was a little bit more fun. There was some pretty big design changes for this version of the Mummy. Much like we talked before about how Frankenstein's mask was mostly a rubber prosthetic and he didn't have to go through hours and hours of makeup, in this version with the Mummy, they didn't actually wrap the actor in gauze like they had for all of the previous Mummy films. It was just a rubber suit. And I'm sure that there's some diehard fans that aren't super happy about that. But an interesting thing about this design is that this is the same design that they used for the Mummy in the 1986 classic movie monsters figure from Imperial Toys. So, you know, it's a pretty iconic look for the Mummy. In this movie, the Mummy only shows up for about 8 minutes of screen time, which is like, okay, it's mostly just an Abbott and Costello movie, and then the Mummy shows up for 8 minutes. But when the Mummy shows up, it's sick. So there you go. This is the time that Abbott and Costello met the Universal monsters. And while I do stand by my original decision of not including those in my original video, I do have one big caveat. I saw someone in my comment section mention how they see the Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein as the true ending to the original Universal Monster movie run. They said it was a really great send-off for those characters, and now that I've seen that movie, I agree. It's a fun team-up movie where we get to see Bela Lugosi and Lon Chaney Jr. We get to see Frankenstein, Wolfman, Dracula. And it's in a fun, goofy team-up movie where they're scaring Abbott and Costello, and it's just, man, that's a great way to remember these movies. And for my last video, I watched like 23 movies in a row, just bang, 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 bang. And by the time I got to the end, I wasn't left happy. I was left kind of burnt out. And so now that I've taken some time and I've watched Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, it really reignited my love for those characters and reminded me how good those first movies truly were. And even though it kind of fell apart towards the end, there was still life to these characters and the actors that played them. I could have missed the other three. To be honest, I don't think that they are necessary viewing if you're a Universal Monster fan, but I'm really glad that I watched them, especially Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man, because that was just like a really great movie. Now, sadly, I'm going to be leaving you guys once again, but don't worry. My next video, which will hopefully be coming out very soon, I'm going to watch the Creature of the Black Lagoon series, which, if I can remember correctly, there's about 186 comments on my last video yelling at me for not watching those movies. But guys, I was not aware that The Creature was considered in the same vein as Dracula and Frankenstein and The Mummy and The Invisible Man as like the core group of Universal monsters. Because The Creature movies didn't start coming out until like 1954, which was like decades and decades and decades after the originals. That's a long time, man. I didn't know that they were connected. Plus, I think, and I could be wrong, so don't yell at me, I think the Creature of the Black Lagoon movies are like the final movies that the final ones. Like, I think that's the end. But I also missed some other key movies that people have been commenting in my last video. So I'm gonna have a third video coming out where I watch movies like Phantom of the Opera, Werewolf in London, you know, the ones that you guys have been yelling at me about. And then, finally then, I will have watched every Universal Monster movie. So if you're interested in seeing those videos, hey, do me a favor, subscribe down below. If you like this video, like this video. Pretty simple. Yeah, dope. See ya. Hi, welcome to the end screen thingy. I don't know where I'm at on the end screen thing, but if you're interested in writing or screenwriting or movies or storytelling, I do a weekly podcast with my writing partner, Robert. It's called Written by Podcast, and every week we either draw a random suggestion from a bowl and write a short film about it, or we compete head-to-head with rival movie pitches. So if you're interested in that, hey, there's a link down below. Also, I have my rankings of the Universal Monster movies on my Letterboxd, also a link down below. Follow me on Instagram, Twitter, do whatever. I'll catch y'all on the flip.